lights are not on. Yeah. I think someone unplugged us also because you got one light on.
Well, thank you very much for being with us. We are expecting about a dozen other Palestinian women who are part of the delegation, but I don't know if they are having difficulties being access to this location. But because we are going to start the meeting of the Security Council soon, we will have them as they come to join us. We have the Minister of Women, my sister Amal Hamad, and two leaders from the General Union of Palestinian Women, but we have a delegation of about 20 women from the governmental side, delegation, and from the civil society. Of course, the delegation is big because the moment is huge. There is a massive aggression and massacre and genocide against our people in Gaza. So the women of Palestine, they wanted to make a huge message of being with you and you, the media, to show that they are here and they are in full force to tell the story of our people. The Secretary General mentioned, and we thank him for that, the tragedy of the Palestinian people and called for a ceasefire. The same thing with the President of the General Assembly, and the same thing with Sima Bahoud, to start the debate and the discussion. Our expectation that the great majority of women ministers will call for a ceasefire, will dwell about the tragedy of Palestinian women, and will bring to the international community the tragedy of the Palestinian people, especially Palestinian women and children. And we are proud to have these women with us here. And as I said, there is a large number of them, but they are in the process of trying to get here. We thank you very much for being with us. We will have a debate in the Security Council. We will have a bigger debate in the General Assembly on the CSW. We have many side events. I invite you to come to these side events so that you will have an opportunity to speak to many Palestinian women who are attending this conference and to ask all the questions that you have in your mind. I think that the Minister wants to say a few words, and we hope that others will join us. You can say it in Arabic. They have people also that like to listen to you in Arabic.
Okay. شكرا. يعني احنا يمكن مجموعة من النساء جئنا من قلب فلسطين، من قلب المعاناة والقهر والظلم في شهر رمضان. اليوم الأول من رمضان كل العالم بيحتفل بالعدل وقيم الحق وقيم السلام، وإحنا بنطمح إلى السلام. جينا بنطلب من كل نساء العالم أن يقفوا بجانب المرأة الفلسطينية، أن يساندوا المرأة الفلسطينية بالضغط على دولة الاحتلال من أجل وقف عاجل وسريع لإطلاق النار، من أجل تدخيل مساعدات إنسانية إغاثية. أهلنا في غزة، وأنا من قطاع غزة، أهلنا في غزة عليهم حرب إبادة جماعية، تطهير عرقي، وحرب تجويع وتعطيش غير مسبوقة. العشرات الآن في قطاع غزة، في شمال قطاع غزة، بموت من الجوع، والمئات تستشهد كل يوم. لدينا 9000 امرأة استشهدت منذ 7 أكتوبر لغاية اليوم، ولدينا 14,000 طفل شهيد أيضا استشهدوا بالقنابل والدبابات اللي كل يوم بتقصف المنازل على رؤوس ساكنيها. رسالتنا للعالم الحر أن يقف بجانب الحق والحقيقة، أن يقف بجانب شعب مظلوم ومقهور، وبجانب المرأة الفلسطينية والطفل الفلسطيني الذي يقتل في كل لحظة وفي كل ثانية في داخل الخيم وأماكن اللجوء. كلمات أخيرة: لا ماء، لا كهرباء، لا دواء، لا مسكن، لا مخبز، لا مستشفى، لا شارع، لا مدرسة، لا يوجد أي معلم من معالم الحياة في قطاع غزة. كل معالم الحياة في قطاع غزة قتلت بفعل آلة الدمار والقتل اللي تم استهدافها بشكل جدي من قبل الاحتلال. لدينا 625 ألف طالب الآن بدون مدارس، لدينا طلاب مدارس، لدينا 88 ألف طالب بدون جامعات، دمرت كامل الجامعات. وبالتالي رسالتنا أن يتم الضغط من أجل وقف عاجل لإطلاق النار، وأن يتم أهلنا في شهر رمضان الفضيل، في هذا الشهر الفضيل وفي هذا اليوم أول شهر رمضان، أن يتم فعلا توفير إغاثة عاجلة من أجل أن يستمروا بالحياة لأهلنا في قطاع غزة. وشكرا لكم.
The main message for those who do not understand Arabic, that she said, I come to tell you the story of the tragedy of our people in Gaza. Everything has been destroyed. 600,000 plus students are without schools, 88,000 college students without universities and places to go, no food, no water, no electricity. It is really a huge catastrophe. And she said, I reiterate the call of the Palestinian people for an immediate ceasefire. That's what we need in order to be able to send what needs to be sent to the people in terms of humanitarian assistance and to stop the tragedy of the forced transfer. She said, we are coming to you with this message. And for you, colleagues and friends, we brought to you just a few days ago 10 members of families and victims of families of the war in Gaza. It was a moving experience. They shared with you the details of their story. Now we are showing you also a larger delegation of Palestinian women coming from Palestine to be here in the CSW, raising their heads, telling the story of the Palestinian people. And I know that this conference is the conference of solidarity with the Palestinian women, with the Palestinian people. This conference will be calling for a ceasefire like millions and maybe billions of people in the street calling for ceasefire. And don't let anyone to deflect the discussion from this huge reality, and tell the story of the Palestinian people, the Palestinian women and their suffering. And we will be talking to you as often as possible. And we thank you very much for being with us. Thank you.
Okay. The 9,572nd meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is the situation in the Middle East, including the Palestinian question. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with the Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representative of Israel to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. On behalf of the Council, I welcome His Excellency Mr. Israel Katz, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Israel. I propose the Council invite the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine to the United Nations to participate in the meeting in accordance with the Provisional Rules of Procedure and the previous practice in this regard. There being no objection, it is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite Ms. Pramila Patton, Special Representative of the Secretary General on Sexual Violence in Conflict, to participate in the meeting. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Ms. Pramila Patton.
Mr. President, distinguished members of the Security Council, I wish to thank the Japanese presidency for convening this meeting and for inviting me to brief. We meet today more than 150 days after Hamas and other armed groups launched a coordinated attack, the deadliest in the history of Israel, which left 1,200 individuals dead across multiple locations in the Gaza periphery, with several thousand wounded. More than 150 days have passed since the abduction of 253 hostages from Israel, with 134 remaining in captivity, their whereabouts and safety unknown. More than 150 days have passed since the start of the military operations in the Gaza Strip, which have resulted in the death of over 30,000 Palestinians, including innocent women and children, leaving more than 70,000 injured, and reducing cities, homes, hospitals, and schools to rubble. Following reports of brutal sexual violence allegedly committed during and in the aftermath of the horrific Hamas-led terror attacks of 7th of October, and at the invitation of the government of Israel, I led an official visit to Israel from the 29th of January to 14th of February. The mission was not investigative in nature. As per its scope and parameters as agreed in advance with the Israeli authorities, the objective was to gather, analyze, and verify reports of conflict-related sexual violence related to 7th of October and its aftermath, in order to inform reporting, including to the Security Council, given the absence of relevant UN entities in Israel. In view of UN-verified information I had received on incidents of sexual violence allegedly committed by Israeli security forces and settlers against Palestinian women and men, one of the agreed parameters was a visit to the occupied West Bank to engage with the Palestinian authorities on these issues and to raise such concerns with the Israeli authorities. Considering the ongoing hostilities, I did not request to visit Gaza, where other UN entities are operational, including some that monitor sexual violence. I must highlight that information received during my visit, along with other UN-verified information on Gaza and the occupied West Bank will be included in the 2023 report of the Secretary General on conflict-related sexual violence. Mr. President, to ensure that the information gathering and verification process would meet the highest standards, I was supported by a highly skilled technical team of 9 experts from the United Nations system, including specialists in safe and ethical interviewing of survivors and witnesses of sexual violence crimes, a forensic pathologist, and a digital and open source information analyst. The mission was conducted in strict adherence with established UN standards and methodologies, and in accordance with the principles of independence, impartiality, objectivity, transparency, integrity, and do no harm, including in relation to guarantees of confidentiality and the protection of victims and witnesses. It also followed a survivor, victim-centered, and trauma-informed approach. Our conclusions were based on our own assessment of the credibility and reliability of the witnesses we met, verifying the sources, cross-referencing the relevant material and information, and assessing whether in all the circumstances there was sufficient, credible, and reliable information to make a finding in fact. While we were presented with some witnesses and materials by the national authorities, each of these were reviewed and assessed for credibility by the team's experts. We accepted some and, where necessary, discarded others. We also gathered our own independent information. The applicable standard of proof we adopted was one of reasonable grounds to believe, consistent with the practice of investigative bodies. Where more information has supported a finding of fact, we have made a finding of clear and convincing information. In a number of cases, we were also able to assess that certain heavily publicized reports or allegations of sexual violence were unfounded. The report of the visit was publicly issued on 4th of March, excluding confidential and identifying details in order to safeguard the privacy of those we spoke to, in line with a victim-centered approach, including principles of informed consent. In this regard, Mr. President, I must be clear and categorical. There has been no attempt by the Secretary General to silence my report or suppress its findings. On the contrary, I received his full support politically, logistically, and financially, and he also gave clear instructions for the public release of my report and its immediate transmission to the Security Council. The mission team conducted meetings with a range of Israeli national institutions, including relevant line ministries. We met with families and relatives of hostages held in captivity and members of communities displaced from several kibbutzim, as well as representatives from Israeli civil society organizations and academia. We conducted confidential interviews with 34 individuals, including survivors and witnesses of the 7th of October attacks, released hostages, first responders, health and service providers. We visited 4 sites of the attacks, as well as the morgue to which the bodies of victims were transferred. We reviewed over 5,000 photographic images and some 50 hours of footage of the attacks, provided partly by state agencies, but also by confidential, independent, and online open sources. Although we met with some witnesses, despite our proactive outreach and efforts, we did not meet with any survivors of sexual violence from the 7th of October attacks itself. Though most appear to have been killed, we have credible information that a handful of survivors are alive and currently receiving treatment for severe trauma. And Mr. President, from experience, I know how long it can take for survivors to speak out. They must be given the chance to come forward on their own terms and in their own term. Excellencies, what I witnessed in Israel were scenes of unspeakable violence perpetrated with shocking brutality, resulting in intense human suffering. In South Israel, I met with traumatized communities, still in shock and deep pain, mourning their loved ones and trying to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. The families and relatives of hostages are enduring a nightmare. I saw the pain in their eyes, and as a mother, I could feel their anguish and heartache. I want to pause here, Mr. President, and invite you and all Council members for just a few seconds to try and put yourself in the shoes of those families of hostages torn between hope and despair. Mr. President, many of them are here in this Council chamber, seeking a glimpse of hope from this august body. 156 days have passed since the abduction of their loved ones, with no less than 16 women among the hostages. What do we tell them? Hostage taking is strictly prohibited under international humanitarian law. Mr. President, information gathered threw light on the indiscriminate and coordinated attacks by Hamas and other armed groups against multiple military and civilian targets, aimed to kill, to inflict suffering, and abduct the maximum number possible of men, women, and children, soldiers and civilians alike, in the minimum possible amount of time. It was a catalogue of the most extreme and inhumane forms of killing, torture, and other horrors. People shot, often in the head and at close range. Families burnt alive in their homes as they tried to hide in their safe rooms. Gunned down or killed by grenades in bomb shelters where they sought refuge. Partygoers hunted down at the Nova Music Festival site, as well as in the fields and roads adjacent to the festival ground. Other violations included sexual violence, abduction of hostages and corpses, the public display of captives, both dead and alive, the mutilation of corpses, including decapitation and desecration of bodies, as well as the looting and destruction of civilian property. In terms of findings on sexual violence, we found clear and convincing information that sexual violence, including rape, sexualized torture, and cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment have been committed against hostages, and we have reasonable grounds to believe that such violence may still be ongoing against those in captivity. I pause here and add, Mr. President, that this finding does not in any way legitimize further hostilities. In fact, it creates a moral imperative for a humanitarian ceasefire to end the unspeakable suffering imposed on Palestinian civilians in Gaza and bring about the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages. Continuation of hostilities can in no way protect them. It can only expose them to further risk of violence, including sexual violence. The Israeli hostages and the millions of civilians in Gaza share a common fate. For their common sake, there must be a humanitarian ceasefire now. With regard to the 7th of October attacks, we found that there are reasonable grounds to believe that conflict-related sexual violence, including rape and gang rape, occurred in at least 3 locations, namely the Nova Music Festival site and its surroundings, Road 232, and Kibbutz Reim. In most of these incidents, victims were first subjected to rape, then killed. In other locations, such as Kibbutz Kfar Aza, while circumstantial information may indicate the occurrence of sexual violence, reported incidents of rape could not be verified. In addition to these specific locations, we also found across multiple locations of the Gaza periphery a pattern of victims, mostly women, found fully or partially naked from the waist down, with their hands tied behind their back and or tied to structures such as trees and poles and shot. Although circumstantial, such a pattern may be indicative of some forms of sexual violence, including sexualized torture, cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment. At the same time, with regards to Kibbutz Be'eri, which was severely affected by the 7th of October attacks, with no less than 10% of its population killed and 50 people taken as hostages, we were also able to determine that at least 2 allegations of sexual violence, which had been widely reported in the media, were unfounded. None of the other reports of sexual violence in Be'eri could be verified at this point. Other reported incidents of sexual violence could not be established for various reasons, including destructive burn damage of multiple bodies. Similarly, the medico-legal assessment of photos and videos of bodies with multiple gunshot wounds, including to intimate body parts, such as breast and genitalia, could not establish a discernible pattern of targeted genital mutilation. Mr. President, members of the Council, sexual violence being a chronically underreported and historically hidden crime, my visit was not intended to determine its prevalence. Neither could I determine whether sexual violence was used as a tactic of war or in a widespread and/or systematic manner. As it was not an investigation, and due to various other challenges, including limited time on the ground and the multiple perpetrators, we did not attempt to determine the attribution of these violations. A determination of attribution will require the conduct of an independent and fully fledged human rights investigation by competent UN bodies. Excellencies, what I witnessed in the occupied West Bank was a climate of intense fear and insecurity, with women and men terrified and deeply disturbed over the ongoing tragedy in Gaza. Regarding my visit to Ramallah, I must stress that its purpose was completely different, as UN-verified reports of conflict-related sexual violence already provided by UN entities on the ground will be included in the annual report of the Secretary General, which will be debated before this Council in April. In this regard, today, I will only share with you reports which I received during my visit to Ramallah, following my meetings with a range of stakeholders, relevant ministries from the Palestinian Authority, human and women's rights organizations, as well as recently released detainees. While I did not receive any reports of rape, interlocutors raised with me instances of sexual violence in the context of detention of male and female Palestinians, such as invasive body searches, unwanted touching of intimate areas, beatings, including in the genital areas, threats of rape against women, and threats of rape against female family members, wives, sisters, daughters, in the case of men, and inappropriate strip searches and prolonged forced nudity of detainees. Sexual harassment and threats of rape during house raids and at checkpoints were also reported, as well as threats of rape if conditions of detention were reported or publicly disclosed after liberation. I raised these reports with the Israeli authorities, who provided me with some information regarding their protocols in place to prevent and address such instances, and they indicated their willingness to investigate any alleged breaches. And in this regard, Mr. President, I wish to express my disappointment that the immediate reaction to my report by some political actors was not to open inquiries into those alleged incidents, but rather to reject them outright via social media. Excellencies, distinguished members of the Security Council, we must translate political resolve into operational responses, which are critical in the current context of unremitting violence. My report makes a number of recommendations, and I would like to highlight a few for this Council's consideration. First, I urge all parties to the conflict to immediately agree on a humanitarian ceasefire. I further urge Hamas to immediately and unconditionally release all hostages. The implicated parties in these hostilities have turned a blind eye to international law. The adoption of an immediate humanitarian ceasefire is more urgent than ever for desperate communities in Gaza to access humanitarian assistance and for the release of hostages. Second, I encourage the government of Israel to grant without further delay access to the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on the Occupied Palestinian Territory, including East Jerusalem and Israel, to carry out fully fledged investigations into all alleged violations that occurred on 7th of October. Truth and recognition of all violations are critical steps in survivors and victims overcoming trauma and regaining a sense of agency. It is also essential to prevent any denial of the atrocities committed on the 7th of October. Truth is the only path towards peace. Third, I call on all relevant and competent bodies, national and international, to bring all perpetrators, regardless of rank and affiliation, to justice based on individual, superior, and command responsibility. Fourth, I encourage the government of Israel to sign a framework of cooperation with my office with a view to prevent and address sexual violence in conflict, including through security sector engagement, training and oversight, as well as to strengthen capacity on justice and accountability for crimes of conflict-related sexual violence. I also call on the government of Israel to take robust measures to mitigate the risk of sexual violence and other forms of cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment in the context of detention and the current military operation. Lastly, I call on all relevant actors to uphold the highest standards of information integrity. Respect for the safety and dignity of survivors is a paramount consideration in the reporting of sexual violence cases. Moreover, the occurrence of sexual violence should never be used as a tool for inflammatory rhetoric, political pressure, or to legitimize further violence in the region. Mr. President, I strongly reject and condemn any instrumentalization of my mandate and report, as well as the plight of victims and survivors, to serve wider political or military ends. To conclude, I echo the Secretary General's messages, namely that on the one hand, nothing can justify the deliberate violence perpetrated by Hamas and other armed groups on the 7th of October against Israel, and on the other hand, nothing can also justify the collective punishment of the people in Gaza, which has left tens of thousands of Palestinians killed and injured, including an unprecedented number of UN staff, with entire communities facing inhumane conditions, including famine and disease. Mr. President, members of the Council, before concluding my remarks, I must also state that I'm horrified by the injustice of women and children being killed in Gaza by countless bombs, gunfire, and I'm also outraged by the level of deaths and pain with entire families, often generations, wiped out. With every bomb that drops, the world becomes more unjust and the road to peace more clouded. The end goal of my mandate is not a war without rape, but a world without war. We must rise to the challenge of our times. Prospects for peace and stability should not be blocked by geopolitical polarization and division. Civilians and their families in both Israel and the occupied Palestinian territory cannot be abandoned by the international community. Survivors of sexual violence and persons at risk must be protected and supported. We cannot fail them. The people of this region need to see a peaceful future at last on the political horizon. We must, Mr. President, replace horror and heartache with healing, humanity, and hope. The credibility of the multilateral system depends on it, and the rules-based international order demands no less. Thank you.
I thank Ms. Patton for her briefing. I now give the floor to the members of the Council. I now give the floor to His Excellency Lord Tariq Ahmed of Wimbledon, Minister of State in the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, Mr. President. May I firstly thank the Special Representative Pramila Patten for briefing us on her recent visit. And may I take this opportunity, SRSG, to applaud your tireless work on this agenda in standing up in defense and protection of victims and survivors of sexual violence. Your visit was profoundly important, and your report an essential insight into the shocking crimes you've just illustrated. It is therefore right that the Security Council considers it today. As we have seen in conflicts around the world, it's a tragic fact: sexual violence is used to terrorize civilians. Mr. President, it shatters lives. It leaves brutal and lifelong scars on victims, their families, and communities. We are collectively and rightly appalled by reports of sexual violence committed by Hamas on the 7th of October and against hostages. I refer to the report and note with deep concern the findings of SRSG Patten, including reasonable grounds to believe that sexual violence occurred in Israel on the 7th of October, and the existence of, and I quote, clear and convincing information that sexual violence has been committed against hostages. Mr. President, it's deeply disturbing to know that such violence may be ongoing against those still in captivity. A direct quote from the report. We continue to call for an immediate, safe, and unconditional release of all hostages, and to work through every channel to secure an immediate stop in the fighting, then progress towards a sustainable ceasefire. Because for us, that is the best route to achieve this. I'm also deeply shocked by the very concerning reports referenced in the SRSG's report, and also by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, of sexual violence perpetrated by Israeli forces against Palestinian detainees, of which we've just heard, who have been arrested and held by Israel. These reports, as we've heard, are being investigated. I therefore call on Israel to take immediate measures to prevent conflict-related sexual violence, to abide by international humanitarian law, and to ensure thorough investigations into these reports, and ultimately for perpetrators to be held to account. Mr. President, let me be absolutely clear. We, the United Kingdom, condemn conflict-related sexual violence unequivocally, wherever it occurs, and stand in solidarity with all victims and survivors. Put it simply, it must stop. Perpetrators must be held accountable. Survivors must receive holistic support. And I call on all members of this Security Council to be unequivocal on these points. And may I say to both Israelis and Palestinians and their representatives here today that the United Kingdom, as a friend to both, is ready to support. As the Prime Minister's Special Representative on preventing sexual violence in conflict, here is my offer on behalf of the United Kingdom. We have our PSVI team of experts who have already been deployed over 90 times. We have the Murad Code, launched last April in this very council, which sets out minimum standards to ensure survivors are not re-traumatized when they are interviewed. We have our stigma toolkit, which provides practical measures to address the stigma faced by survivors in criminal justice systems. Indeed, earlier today, I chaired a meeting with members of the International Alliance on Preventing Sexual Violence in Conflict, and I was pleased that SRSG Patten was able to attend, alongside a colleague of mine, Baroness Hellich, who was instrumental in establishing this very initiative I lead in 2012, to consider new and innovative ways to ensure crimes are fully investigated. Testimonies are held to account to allow for successful prosecution, and those who survive these shocking and abhorrent crimes, the incredible, courageous, brave survivors, are supported fully in rebuilding their lives. We fully agree with the SRSG that investigation should be conducted in a safe and ethical manner, consistent with a survivor-centered approach. Mr. President, all reports of sexual violence must be fully investigated to ensure justice for survivors and victims. Mr. President, justice delayed is justice denied, and for the United Kingdom, it remains that a two-state solution is the only way to achieve justice and security for both Israelis and Palestinians. The first step must be an immediate stop to the fighting, leading to a permanent, sustainable ceasefire, the release of all hostages, and vital humanitarian life-saving aid to be delivered to Gaza. It is this solution that we seek. We owe it to the legacy of every innocent civilian killed in Israel and across the occupied Palestinian territories, to utilize every lever we have and every channel we have in pursuit of this noble objective. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank His Excellency Lord Ahmed of Wimbledon for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of France.
Monsieur le Président, je remercie tout d'abord Madame Patten pour son exposé et je lui redis tout le soutien de la France. Celle-ci condamne toutes les formes de violences sexuelles et en particulier celles liées au conflit. Ces crimes sont trop souvent passés sous silence, tout comme la stigmatisation dont les survivantes font ensuite l'objet. La France condamne le viol utilisé comme arme de guerre partout où il est commis. Les violences sexuelles commises par le Hamas et d'autres groupes terroristes le 7 octobre relèvent de la barbarie. Personne ne peut fermer les yeux sur ces actes qui ont été documentés, y compris par les Nations Unies, comme le souligne le rapport de la représentante spéciale. Ces violences doivent être reconnues, condamnées, et leurs auteurs doivent être punis. Il n'est inacceptable que le Conseil de sécurité et l'Assemblée générale n'aient pas encore été en mesure de condamner clairement ces actes terroristes et ces violences. La France fera tout pour que la réalité des crimes du 7 octobre soit reconnue et ne puisse pas être remise en cause. Elle rappelle que les violences sexuelles commises en période de conflit sont susceptibles de constituer des crimes sanctionnés par le droit international. Elle appelle une nouvelle fois à la libération immédiate et inconditionnelle de tous les otages. Le rapport de Mme Patten indique également qu'elle a reçu des informations sur certaines formes de violences sexuelles à l'encontre d'hommes et de femmes palestiniens dans des lieux de détention, lors de descentes de police et au point de contrôle. Il conviendra de faire la lumière sur ces allégations. Le droit international s'impose à tout le monde. La France est déterminée à éliminer toutes les formes de violences sexuelles liées au conflit, notamment l'utilisation du viol comme arme de guerre, et à lutter contre l'impunité de ceux qui les commettent. Monsieur le Président, en ce début de Ramadan, et alors qu'aucun accord n'a été trouvé sur une cessation des hostilités, la France renouvelle son appel à un cessez-le-feu immédiat et durable afin de permettre l'acheminement de l'aide humanitaire et la protection des civils. L'absence d'accès suffisant à une population en situation d'urgence humanitaire absolue est injustifiable. Elle appelle une nouvelle fois Israël à autoriser sans délai l'ouverture de toutes les voies d'accès possibles, notamment le port d'Ashdod, une voie directe depuis la Jordanie, et tous les points de passage nécessaires pour acheminer massivement l'aide. La France rappelle par ailleurs que seule la solution des deux États, qui implique la création d'un État palestinien, est à même de répondre aux besoins de sécurité d'Israël et du peuple israélien et de répondre aux aspirations légitimes des Palestiniens à un État vivant dans la paix et la sécurité aux côtés d'Israël. La France continuera de s'engager pleinement dans ce sens. Je vous remercie.
I thank the representative of France for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Sierra Leone.
Mr. President, thank you for convening this meeting. I thank Special Representative on Sexual Violence and Conflict, Ms. Primila Patten, for your briefing highlighting critical findings of the report of your official visits to Israel and Palestine, in particular occupied West Bank, from 29 January to 14 February 2024. In our first statement on the Middle East Palestine question in this Council, following the 7 October 2023 attack on Israeli civilians, we noted the important context of the ongoing occupation of Palestine by Israel. As we have stated repeatedly in our condemnation, the 7 October 2023 attack by Hamas and other armed groups on Israeli civilians was very harrowing, contravening international law protection of civilians, even in the context of the ongoing occupation. Equally condemnable is the military response by Israel, with serious allegations of collective punishment and other breaches of international law. As we continue to urge accountability, including through individual criminal as well as state responsibility, for all violations of international law, in particular, international humanitarian law, we note the important step taken by SRSG Pattern to undertake the visit and commence an independent process of, and I quote, gathering, analyzing, and verifying information on conflict-related sexual violence in the context of the attacks on 7 October 2023 and their aftermath, end of quote. Mr. President, we have read with serious concern the mission report, which, and I quote, describes findings on incidents and patterns of CRSV, one during the 7 October attacks, and two in the context of the abduction and hostage taking, end of quote. We also note the limitations of the mission report as further contextualized and explained during the press briefing at the United Nations by SRSG Pattern and team last week. We further note the mission report, and I quote, was neither intended to and could not, in a very short period of time, establish the prevalence of CRSV during and after 7 October attacks. Notwithstanding that the overall magnitude, scope, and specific attribution of the CRSV violations would require a comprehensive investigation by competent bodies, any acts of sexual violence and CRSV must be condemned as a violation of international law and the dignity of not only the victims, survivors, but also their families and the whole of society. Mr. President, we further note with deep concern the report of a dramatic deterioration of the human rights situation in West Bank following the 7 October attack. We note the report of mass arrests and a huge spike in settlers' violence following the commencement of law enforcement operations by Israel. Additionally, we note with deep concern reports about cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment of Palestinians in detention, including a report of various forms of sexual violence. In light of the serious findings of the mission report, Sierra Leone welcomes the call for a comprehensive investigation by competent bodies with adequate time and capacity. We further lend support to the recommendations contained in the mission report, including, firstly, the call on the government of Israel to grant, and I quote, access to the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem and Israel, to carry out fully fledged investigations into all alleged violations, end of quote. Secondly, we support the call for immediate access and the unconditional release of all hostages held by Hamas and other armed groups. We are seriously alarmed by the mission's report's indication, and I quote, based on first-hand accounts of released hostages, of reasonable grounds to believe that female hostages were also subjected to other forms of sexual violence. We therefore reiterate the responsibility of the parties to the conflict to protect all civilians, including the hostages. Thirdly, we emphasize the need for a humanitarian ceasefire that will create a conducive atmosphere to address the ongoing humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip and allow for thorough and comprehensive investigation into violations of international law, including conflict-related sexual violence. Let me close, Mr. President, with 3 concluding points. First, we urge the parties to the conflict to refrain from the practices of misinformation and disinformation. We deplore the spread of information, including the deliberate spread inconsistent with realities on the ground, with the intention to influence public opinion and create harmful propaganda. Second, in the holy month of Ramadan, this Council must continue to take steps to ensure we discharge our mandate in demanding an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. Third and finally, for lasting peace in the region and to guarantee the security and safety of Israeli and Palestinian civilians, we stress the need for a political horizon anchored on the 2-state solution, with Israel and Palestine living side by side in peace and security. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Sierra Leone for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of China.
诸位先生，我首先要感谢帕腾特别代表的通报。妇女是最脆弱的群体之一，她们的权益最容易受到伤害，也最需要得到保护。中方谴责武装冲突中针对妇女的一切形式的暴力，主张及时全面调查这种违反国际人道法和人权法的行为，坚决依法惩处施暴者，并还受害者以公道和尊严。对于受害幸存者，应该给予有针对性的支持，帮助他们早日治愈心灵的创伤。诸位先生，帕腾女士日前应邀访问以色列，并走访备战的约旦河西岸。访问后发表的报告指出，有合理理由相信，在10月7日袭击事件期间，加沙周边多地发生冲突中的性暴力行为。有明确和令人信服的信息，表明部分人质遭到多种形式的性暴力。报告同时表示，在约旦河西岸拘留点关押的巴勒斯坦人遭受过残酷、非人道和有辱尊严的待遇。报告反映的情况令人震惊，受害者的不幸遭遇令人同情。报告还就有关后续行动提出了具体建议，希望有关方面对此予以重视，做出积极的回应。诸位先生，我们同意特别代表女士的看法。我们所寻求的不是没有性暴力的战争，而是结束战争本身。加沙冲突持续5个月，已经对妇女造成难以名状的伤害，超过9000名母亲、女儿遇难，数十万妇女流离失所，缺乏基本生存和安全保障，面临死亡、饥饿和疾病，深陷恐惧、绝望和愤怒。今天已经是斋月的第1天。斋月对穆斯林信众是一段神圣的日子。我们呼吁国际社会紧急行动起来，加倍付出努力，推动立即实现停火止战，给加沙民众保留活下去的希望。我们也呼吁加大外交努力，让所有被扣押的人员能够早日得到释放，同家人团聚。谢谢主席。
I thank the representative of China for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Guyana.
Mr. President, I thank Special Representative of the Secretary General, Pramila Patten, for her briefing, which paints a disturbing picture of the horrors that innocent civilians suffered and continue to suffer as this war wages on. Taking note of the challenges that the mission team faced and the limited mandate of the visit, the assessment provided by SRSG Patten is nevertheless cause for grave concern. The incidents of sexual violence in Israel and the West Bank contained in the report add another horrific dimension to the tragedy unfolding in the Middle East. Guyana strongly condemns all acts of sexual violence committed in this conflict, including those committed on October 7th. We call for the cessation of all sexual violence and for leaders to take proactive steps to prevent and enforce accountability for such acts. Perpetrators must be held accountable. We are deeply concerned by the report's indication that the hostages were subjected to sexual violence and that there are reasonable grounds to believe that such violence is ongoing. Guyana reiterates its call for the immediate release of all hostages and all individuals held unlawfully, and demand that those holding them in captivity and in detention ensure their safety, including from sexual violence. We are also gravely concerned about the reports of cruel, inhumane, and degrading treatment meted out to Palestinians in detention. This includes sexual violence allegedly committed in the occupied West Bank against Palestinian men and women in detention settings during house raids and at checkpoints. Guyana supports the call for full and independent investigations into all alleged incidents of sexual violence. We also support the report's recommendation to strengthen the capacity of the United Nations to monitor and report on incidents of CRSV in both Israel and the occupied Palestinian territory. We have taken note of the mission team's determination that at least 2 allegations of sexual violence, which had been widely reported in the media, were unfounded. We call on all parties to be responsible and avoid sensational headlines, as this risks bringing into question and diminishing the horrific experiences of genuine victims. Mr. President, as we examine the SRSG's report, it is essential that we consider the impacts of this war on women and children in a holistic manner. Of the persons killed in Gaza, 70% are women and children. In excess of 60 women are killed daily. More than half of the 1.9 million persons displaced are women. They are the hardest hit by starvation and famine in Gaza, with unprecedented malnutrition. Many have been widowed and left to fend for their children and other family members, including those who were injured. There is lack of adequate access to water and no facilities for menstrual hygiene management, including sanitary supplies. All of this affects women's dignity as well as their mental and physical health. In short, women and children are the ones suffering the most in this war, a pattern we have seen across armed conflicts time and again, even though they are not the ones waging war. Mr. President, extreme pain is palpable in both Israel and Palestine. Both have experienced unprecedented levels of anguish since October 7. Once again, we condemn the attacks by Hamas on Israel, which occurred on October 7. However, there is no justification for the continued killing, maiming, and starving of innocent civilians in Gaza, the majority of whom are women and children. All must abide with international law, including international humanitarian law. This war must stop. Guyana continues to call for an immediate ceasefire. This is the only option for scaling up of humanitarian assistance, saving lives, and preventing further suffering of innocent civilians. This is the only way we can begin to recover from the horrors faced by the people in Gaza and ensure the safe release of the hostages. A ceasefire is also an essential step for us to move forward with a 2-state solution, with the people of Israel and Palestine living side by side in peace and security. There have been too many casualties in this war. The quest for peace and security must not be one of them. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Guyana for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would first like to extend my appreciation to SRSG Ms. Patton for her briefing and the work of the extensive report addressing the critical issue of conflict-related sexual violence. We are profoundly shocked by incidents of sexual violence detailed in the SRSG report on the occasion of 7th October terrorist attacks by Hamas, and within the context of abduction and hostage-taking. With regards to hostages, the report reaches an even more disturbing conclusion that there is reasonable ground to believe that such violence may still be ongoing until now. We condemn in the strongest terms the heinous terrorist attacks by Hamas and all sexual and other forms of violence against women and girls during the attack. We also strongly urge Hamas and other armed groups to immediately and unconditionally release all hostages. This is unacceptable regardless of any excuses. Mr. President, sexual violence should never be used as a tactic of conflict. It is no longer an inherent byproduct of conflicts. As the Rome Statute of the ICC provides for, rape and other forms of serious sexual violence committed as part of a widespread or systematic attack could constitute crimes against humanity. All perpetrators of crimes against humanity must be held accountable, and the zero-tolerance policies should be extended to those who bear responsibility. To this end, we strongly support the report's recommendation for a full-fledged investigative process with the cooperation of national authorities and OHCHR. This will bring light to the complete extent of alleged violations. Furthermore, all necessary measures should be undertaken to ensure accountability. Mr. President, we are also seriously concerned about the allegations of sexual violence by Israeli security forces in the West Bank, as mentioned in the report. In this regard, we hope that all allegations can be thoroughly investigated and the perpetrators will be held accountable. Mr. President, the ongoing conflict in Gaza has disproportionate effects on women. Statistics show that 70% of civilians killed were women or children, and nearly 1 million women and girls have been displaced. We are deeply concerned that prolonged humanitarian catastrophe over the past 5 months has led to limited access to food, clean water, and medical supplies in Gaza. Malnutrition and starvation have inflicted unspeakable pain and hardship on innocent people, in particular women, including pregnant and breastfeeding women. The protection of civilians must be ensured under all circumstances, in accordance with both international humanitarian law and international human rights law. As the conflict persists, the suffering of civilians becomes even more widespread, exacerbating already prevailing tensions in the region. As Ramadan, the holy month for all Muslims, has commenced, concerns over the catastrophic situation in Gaza are heightened more than ever. This tragedy must end. We once again reiterate the urgent need for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire in Gaza. In conclusion, Mr. President, the Republic of Korea would like to stress that our dedicated efforts to find a solution to end the agony and the fear in Israel and Palestine in the longer term must continue. And we hope that sincere dialogue and negotiations to realize the two-state solution can resume at the earliest possible juncture. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the Republic of Korea for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Malta.
Thank you, President. And I also thank SRG Patton for her briefing today. We take this opportunity to reaffirm our support to SRG Patton and her office and the important work they carry out. Malta remains deeply concerned with the continued state of hostilities in Gaza and beyond. we reiterate our condemnation of the Hamas terror attacks of 7th October. The consequences of those barbaric actions, including rape and sexual torture, are still being felt by families who lost their loved ones and by those who are still being held hostage by Hamas. They are in our thoughts, and we once again extend our deepest condolences to all those who have been directly affected and to the people of Israel. The lasting trauma and anguish that the attacks carried out on that dark day are still having on the lasting trauma and anguish that the attacks carried out on that dark day are still having on Israeli society cannot be dismissed or understated. On the other hand, the scale of human suffering and the humanitarian catastrophe that continues to unfold in Gaza is deeply troubling and concerning. Equally worrying is the prospect of an expansion of the conflict into Rafah, the deteriorating situation in the West Bank, and other violence throughout the wider region. The prospect of further hostilities and conflict will only result in further suffering. In this vein, an immediate and permanent ceasefire remains the only avenue through which we can prevent a further deterioration and begin addressing the impact of the Israel-Hamas war. This includes the disproportionate impact of this conflict on women and girls. Over 30,000 Palestinians, including an estimated 9,000 women, have been killed in Gaza to date. In this context, we recall that the Arms Trade Treaty requires states to, inter alia, hold transfers when there is a substantial risk that they will be used to commit or facilitate serious acts of gender-based violence or serious acts of violence against women and children. Furthermore, the bombardment of hospitals, restriction on fuel, electricity, food, water, and aid place pregnant women and newborns at significant risk of physical and mental harm, restricts access to necessary and protected medical care, undermine the health of postpartum women. President, for Malta, giving priority to women, peace and security means upholding information, integrity and ethical, trauma-informed representations of conflict-related sexual violence. Malta is appalled by the reports of Israeli women subjected to sexual violence across 3 reported locations on 7th October, and that some hostages taken to Gaza have been subjected to various forms of conflict-related sexual violence, which may be ongoing. In this regard, we also look forward to assessing the report of the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on the OPT. We urge Israel to fully cooperate with the Commission and the OHCHR and to give them access. We reiterate that the immediate and unconditional release of hostages, as outlined in 2 of our resolutions, Resolution 2712 and 2720, must be a top priority. We are equally appalled by UN's experts' reports of sexual violence against Palestinian men and women in detention during house raids and at checkpoints. We emphasize that accountability for all criminal actions must be ensured. In this context, we highlight that advancing the Women, Peace and Security agenda means ensuring that CRSV agenda is not instrumentalized. This includes respecting and safeguarding the dignity, the identity and dignity of survivors. To this end, we recommend to the parties of this conflict that they implement the recommendations just outlined by SRSG pattern. In conclusion, President, the rights and opportunities of Israeli and Palestinian women, peace activists, journalists, and human rights defenders to contribute to de-escalation, ceasefire, and other efforts to negotiate peace must be upheld. Malta will also remain fully committed to achieving a lasting and sustainable peace in the Middle East, which is based on the two-state solution along the pre-1967 borders and which addresses the legitimate aspirations of both Israelis and Palestinians towards mutual peace and security. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Malta for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Mozambique.
Thank you, Mr. President. I wish to thank the President of the Council for convening this important briefing on the Middle East with a particular focus on conflict-related sexual violence. We are also grateful to Ms. Pramila Patten, Special Representative of the Secretary General on Sexual Violence in Conflict, for her insights on this deeply concerning matter. Mr. President, as the whole month of Ramadan commences, we deeply regret that the ceasefire in Gaza has not been achieved despite relentless negotiations. The persistent bombardments in the occupied Palestinian territories present severe risk to civilians, violating fundamental rights including access to food, health care, and protection. Compounding these injustices is the traumatic threat of sexual violence to civilians as reported in the mission report presented to us. As the SRSG's mission report highlights, documenting sexual violence crimes in conflict situations is an arduous task requiring meticulous effort, courage, and commitment to truth, particularly so amidst the current chaos and turmoil on the ground. The situation demands scrupulous documentation, courage, and unwavering commitment to uncovering the truth. While this process continues, we must address the safety and uphold the well-being of civilians caught in the crossfire. Even if we are not in physical proximity to this conflict, we must be certain that the impact disproportionately affect the most vulnerable members of society. Mr. President, the situation demands our undivided attention due to the enormous challenges, harm, and trauma experienced by civilians as well as dire humanitarian situation. This is precisely why the United Nations, the Security Council, and the international community share a collective responsibility to urgently pursue de-escalation in this conflict to prioritize the needs and well-being of these vulnerable populations. The relentless violence between Israeli settlers and Palestinians in the occupied West Bank, coupled with the ongoing bombardment in the war-ravaged Gaza Strip, demands our immediate intervention. All parties must fully respect international humanitarian law, as rape and other forms of sexual violence constitute grave violations in armed conflict. We strongly urge all parties to pursue a peaceful resolution and a cessation of hostilities during this sacred month of Ramadan. We should all pause and reflect on whether our world needs further bloodshed and violence. Mr. President, Mozambique strongly encourages the ongoing diplomatic efforts from different actors, including some members of this Council, to reach an agreement between the parties and relaunch the two-state solution and peaceful coexistence between the two peoples in full respect of the Security Council and the General Assembly relevant resolutions. Let us seize this opportunity to protect civilians, uphold human rights, and pave the way for a just and sustainable resolution to this long-standing conflict. As we have consistently maintained, the path to lasting peace requires unwavering commitment, courage, empathy, and compassion. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Mozambique for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Господин председатель, Российская Федерация категорически осуждает сексуальное насилие во всех формах, как и любые другие преступления в вооруженном конфликте и в постконфликтных ситуациях. Подобные деяния должны расследоваться, а виновные привлекаться к ответственности. В контексте кризиса вокруг Газы мы с самого начала безоговорочно осудили акты насилия, совершенные в отношении израильтян 7 октября. При этом мы придерживаемся твердого убеждения в том, что эти преступления, сколь бы ужасными они ни были, не могут рассматриваться в качестве оправдания для коллективного наказания палестинцев, проживающих в секторе Газа и Насбри, и совершаемых Израилем вопиющих нарушений международного гуманитарного права в отношении мирного палестинского населения. Эту нашу позицию, насколько мы можем судить, разделяет подавляющее большинство государств мира. В этой связи мы приветствуем любые усилия, нацеленные на то, чтобы пролить свет на преступления, совершаемые в ходе палестино-израильского конфликта. Убеждены в том, что ООН не предпринимает достаточных мер на этом направлении. Гибнут тысячи людей. Международный суд ООН констатирует высокую вероятность геноцида, происходящего в настоящий момент на территории сектора Газа, а ООН, по сути, не имеет доступа для получения достоверной информации. Израиль намеренно создает препятствия для такого доступа. На этом фоне Западный Иерусалим приглашает спецпредставителя Генерального секретаря ООН по вопросу о сексуальном насилии госпожу Паттон в сопровождении 9 экспертов для краткого визита в Израиль и на западный берег реки Иордан. По итогам этого визита госпожа спецпредставитель выпускает отдельный доклад. Важно отметить, что этот визит не включает посещение сектора Газа, да и вообще не предполагает возможности проведения расследования преступлений или атрибуции актов. В этой связи вообще не ясно, о каком сотрудничестве Израиля с миссией идет речь в докладе. В целом очевидно, что Западный Иерусалим демонстрирует селективный подход к посещению ООНовцами страны и оккупированных палестинских территорий. Мы, разумеется, вынуждены принимать этот факт во внимание при выработке наших соответствующих оценок. Не можем также не учитывать при этом общую репутацию госпожи Паттон, прославившуюся использованием в своей работе фейков, что, разумеется, подрывает доверие к ее выводам и наработкам. Все упомянутые мною обстоятельства создают специфический контекст для нашего сегодняшнего заседания. Иными словами, нам сегодня акцентируют лишь частичную информацию в рамках специфического мандата и предлагают на нее реагировать. Хотя, по сути, мы имеем дело с некой полуправдой, которая никоим образом не дает общей картины происходящего и не отменяет требования к правительству Израиля обеспечить доступ в регион механизмов и агентств ООН для сбора полной информации о грубых и систематических нарушениях международного гуманитарного права в отношении гражданского населения в ходе операций в секторе Газа и на Западном берегу. В частности, спецпредставителю Генерального секретаря по детям и вооруженному конфликту. Только после всестороннего и объективного изучения ситуации во всем ее географическом объеме можно будет делать какие-либо выводы. Сейчас же момент для этого явно не пришел. Тем более, что полученный по итогам миссии доклад нельзя назвать исчерпывающим даже по заявленной теме. Команде госпожи Паттон не удалось встретиться с жертвами сексуального насилия, которые имели место в ходе печальных событий 7 октября, согласно докладу. В целом, по признанию спецпредставителя, данные в основном были получены от правительства Израиля и нуждаются в дальнейшем изучении и расследовании. Отдельно хотели бы указать на то, что используемые госпожой Паттон определения и методы работы не являются согласованными, и наше участие в данной дискуссии по ее докладу и по этой теме не означают их принятие или одобрение. При этом содержащаяся в докладе информация об изнасилованиях, а также выводы миссии о вероятности дальнейшего сексуального насилия в отношении заложников шокируют. Сексуальному насилию в отношении израильтян нет оправдания. Виновные должны быть привлечены к ответственности. Также нет оправдания и случаям сексуализированного насилия в отношении палестинцев и палестинок со стороны израильских сил безопасности, в частности, в форме угрозы изнасилований, раздевания, ударов по гениталиям. Эти явления, по свидетельству ООН и правозащитных НПО, носят систематический характер и продолжаются уже десятилетиями. С интенсификацией кампании по произвольным арестам палестинцев на Западном берегу, а после 7 октября были задержаны около 7500 человек, ситуация только ухудшилась. При этом, как свидетельствует доклад, эти преступления не расследуются, виновные пользуются безнаказанностью. Призываем Израиль покончить с этой позорной практикой и обеспечить жертвам насилия доступ к правосудию. Отмечаем также, что миссия спецпредставителя не нашла подтверждения растиражированным в израильской прессе наиболее громким случаям, в частности в кибуце Беери и на базе Нахаль-Оз. Это еще раз доказывает, что выводы, особенно касающиеся ситуации конфликта, можно делать только после тщательной проверки поступающих данных. Не следует слепо верить заявлениям прессы. Важно помнить, что в ходе вооруженных действий могут иметь место заявления, цель которых – провоцирование в обществе вражды и ненависти, что в условиях текущей эскалации на Ближнем Востоке критически опасно. Побороть безнаказанность, положить конец насилию, в том числе сексуальному, возможно только тогда, когда мы имеем объективную и проверенную информацию. Россия категорически отвергает попытки манипулирования важным вопросом борьбы с насилием в конфликте. Считаем неприемлемой ситуацию, когда страдания людей, переживших сексуальное насилие или обвинение в этом тяжком преступлении, становятся разменной монетой в политических играх. Господин председатель, после насилия 7 октября, которое мы категорически осуждаем, спираль преступлений приняла поистине катастрофические масштабы. Мы решительно осуждаем грубые и систематические нарушения международного гуманитарного права и международного права в области прав человека, совершаемые Израилем против гражданского населения в секторе Газа, в результате которых погибло около 30 тысяч человек, большинство из которых – женщины и дети. Несмотря на всю сложность повестки борьбы с секс-насилием, она не должна заслонять собой острейшие гуманитарные вызовы и угрозы миру и безопасности, возникшие в результате израильской операции в Газе. Массовое истребление гражданского населения, включая детей, катастрофический голод, провоцирование массового перемещения. Чтобы побороть безнаказанность, положить конец насилию, в том числе сексуальному, необходимо сделать все, чтобы остановить этот конфликт. Сейчас для этого необходимо прежде всего срочное и безоговорочное прекращение огня. Надеемся, что Совет Безопасности все-таки сможет потребовать этого от сторон в ближайшее время. Благодарю вас.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Slovenia.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. At the outset, I would also like to thank SRSG, Pamela Patton, for her briefing and presentation of the mission report on her official visit to Israel and the occupied West Bank, which took place earlier this year. We welcome the visit of the SRSG, and we acknowledge significant challenges to the mission team's efforts. We are extremely concerned about findings in the report, which underscore the urgent need for action. I would like to once again strongly condemn the terrorist attack of Hamas and other armed groups on 7 October 2023. We urgently call for the release of all hostages, and we continue to call for an immediate ceasefire. Let me now make the following remarks on the report. First, Slovenia condemns any form of conflict-related sexual violence as a gross violation of human rights. We are concerned that there are reasonable grounds to believe that conflict-related sexual violence occurred during the 7 October attacks in multiple locations across southern Israel. We believe there is a need to further investigate these allegations in order to find perpetrators and hold them accountable. In this respect, we expect Israel to grant access to relevant UN mechanisms, including Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights and Commission of Inquiry, to be able to carry out full-fledged investigation. Second, we remain extremely concerned about the situation of hostages, and we insist on their immediate and unconditional release. We also urge for the crucial access of the ICRC to the hostages. The mission found clear and convincing information about some hostages being subjected to various forms of conflict-related sexual violence. The mission further informed there are reasonable grounds to believe that such violence may still be ongoing. We have repeatedly called for a ceasefire in Gaza in order to achieve the release of hostages and prevent their continuing torment, and to prevent further civilian suffering and destruction in Gaza. Third, sexual violence has no justification, and it can neither serve as justification. We are equally concerned about reports of cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment of Palestinians in detention during house raids and at checkpoints. These reports, too, need to be investigated. Let me express our concern over the dramatic growth in the number of Palestinians arrested and detained in the recent months. The ICRC must be notified of and allowed to visit Palestinians in Israeli detention. Moreover, I want to touch upon the immense suffering of women in Gaza. While we are still awaiting the solution by this Security Council and/or through negotiations between the parties, the totality of harm done to the women in this conflict must not be forgotten. Women in Gaza have been facing a collapse in the health system, hunger and starvation, and unprecedented destruction. They have also been facing severe limitations in access to food, water, medicine, hygiene products, and safety in every sense of the word. We call for respect of international law, including international humanitarian law and human rights law. Mr. President, sexual violence in conflict is on the rise globally, and only a strong international response to it can change that. It continues to be used as a tactic of war, an intimidation tool, in many situations on the agenda of the Security Council. Once again, Slovenia strongly condemns the use of sexual violence in all settings. It must stop immediately, as it represents a serious violation of international humanitarian law and human rights law, and may amount to war crimes and crimes against humanity. We advocate for international collaboration to ensure that evidence is meticulously gathered and perpetrators are brought to justice. Ensuring accountability is of paramount importance. Let me conclude by expressing our strong support for the UN and the mandate of the Special Representative. We are looking forward to the upcoming discussion on the Secretary General's annual report on conflict-related sexual violence, where we will be able to touch upon this and other tragic situations. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Slovenia for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Switzerland.
Monsieur le Président, je vous remercie d'avoir convoqué cette séance du Conseil de sécurité. Il est important que le Conseil se penche sur ce thème. Je remercie également la représentante spéciale Pramila Patten pour son exposé et son rapport. La violence sexuelle dans les situations de conflit constitue une violation grave du droit international humanitaire et des droits de l'homme et peut constituer un crime de guerre, voire un crime contre l'humanité. Il est par conséquent impératif que le Conseil condamne unanimement toute violence sexuelle liée au conflit dans le contexte du conflit au Proche-Orient, comme dans tous les conflits armés, et agisse pour empêcher qu'elle ne se reproduise. La Suisse est profondément choquée par les faits présentés dans le rapport de Mme Patten. Je souhaite exprimer ici toute la sympathie et le soutien de mon pays aux survivantes et aux victimes de ces violences. En premier lieu, aux femmes et aux jeunes filles qui les ont subies et à leurs proches. Nous appelons à ce que la dignité des survivantes et des victimes soit respectée en toutes circonstances. Dès le 7 octobre dernier, nous avons répété à maintes reprises notre ferme condamnation des actes de terreur perpétrés par le Hamas qui ont fait plus de 1200 victimes en Israël. Parmi ces victimes, le rapport souligne qu'il existe des motifs raisonnables de penser que des violences à caractère sexuel, y compris des viols collectifs et des faits de torture à caractère sexuel, ont été commis à plusieurs endroits. Le rapport fait également état de violences similaires contre les otages. Il est à craindre que de telles violences sont encore subies par les otages toujours en captivité, dont la Suisse n'a eu de cesse d'appeler à la libération immédiate et inconditionnelle. La Suisse réitère sa condamnation ferme de toute violence sexuelle. Nous appelons à l'établissement des faits par les organes compétents, comme le Haut Commissariat aux droits de l'homme ou la commission d'enquête, afin de contribuer à l'identification des violations et de leurs auteurs et que ceux-ci ne restent pas impunis. Nous appelons également à ce que le Haut Commissariat et la commission d'enquête reçoivent l'accès nécessaire à cette fin. Les enquêtes doivent être menées sur toutes les violations du droit international commises en Israël et dans l'ensemble du territoire palestinien occupé et leurs auteurs traduits en justice auprès des instances pertinentes. À cet effet, la Cour pénale internationale mène actuellement une enquête sur la situation dans le territoire palestinien occupé qui couvre tant les faits relevant du 7 octobre que les événements en cours à Gaza et en Cisjordanie. Monsieur le Président, la Suisse soutient aussi la recommandation du rapport pour un cessez-le-feu humanitaire immédiat à Gaza. Un tel cessez-le-feu est nécessaire pour protéger les populations civiles, leur fournir l'aide humanitaire dont elles ont urgemment besoin et libérer les otages. L'expertise en matière de violences sexuelles liées au conflit doit être prise en compte dans la conception et la mise en œuvre de tout accord. La poursuite des hostilités à Gaza s'accompagne en effet d'une augmentation des violences basées sur le genre. La Suisse condamne le fait que les hostilités continuent de faire de nombreuses victimes civiles à Gaza, dont près de 9000 femmes. Toujours selon les Nations Unies, 3000 sont devenues veuves et 95% des mères n'ont pas assez à manger. Les besoins spécifiques des femmes et filles en matière d'intimité, de sécurité et d'hygiène ne sont pas satisfaits. Elles n'ont pas accès aux services de santé, y compris à la santé sexuelle et reproductive, aux services de protection contre les violences basées sur le genre et sont confrontées aux formes les plus graves de violences obstétriques. Nous sommes très préoccupés par les informations contenues dans le rapport concernant les violences sexuelles et basées sur le genre contre des Palestiniennes et Palestiniens dans les lieux de détention, lors de raids dans les maisons et aux points de contrôle à Gaza et en Cisjordanie. Nous prenons bonne note que ces informations compléteront celles déjà vérifiées par d'autres entités de l'ONU et qu'elles pourront être incluses dans le prochain rapport du secrétaire général concernant la violence sexuelle dans les conflits armés. Monsieur le Président, comme l'a dit la représentante spéciale Patton, l'objectif ultime n'est pas une guerre sans viol, c'est un monde sans guerre. Ce Conseil doit à tout prix mettre fin à la spirale de violence actuelle au Moyen-Orient et relancer un processus de dialogue en vue d'une solution politique à ce conflit. Dans ce processus, la participation pleine, égale et significative de femmes palestiniennes et israéliennes est essentielle pour contribuer à une solution à deux États démocratiques, Israël et la Palestine, vivant côte à côte, en paix, à l'intérieur de frontières sûres et reconnues dont Gaza fait partie intégrante. Je vous remercie.
I thank the representative of Switzerland for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Ecuador.
Gracias, señor presidente. En primer lugar, agradezco a la representante especial del secretario general sobre violencia sexual, Pramila Pattern, por su intervención de esta tarde, y al secretario general por haber puesto en conocimiento del Consejo el informe de la misión realizada por la señora Pattern a Israel y a la Cisjordania ocupada. Señor presidente, la violencia sexual en los conflictos, por desgracia, continúa siendo una práctica recurrente. Una amplia gama de perpetradores, como grupos armados estatales o no estatales, grupos terroristas, mercenarios y bandas criminales o pandillas, la utilizan para amedrentar, humillar, castigar e infundir terror en la población civil. La humanidad entera debe repudiar tales prácticas. Hoy, precisamente, nos convoca un caso atroz de este tipo de violencia. El informe que hemos recibido señala que existen motivos fundados para creer que, durante los ataques terroristas perpetrados por Hamas el pasado 7 de octubre, se produjeron actos de violencia sexual en al menos 3 ubicaciones, incluyendo casos de violación y violación grupal. Además, la misión encontró información clara y convincente de que algunos de los rehenes han sido víctimas de violencia sexual durante su cautiverio, incluyendo violaciones y torturas sexuales, y motivos fundados para creer que tales actos probablemente continúan sucediendo. Señor presidente, desde el 7 de octubre del 2023, el Ecuador ha condenado inequívocamente los ataques terroristas perpetrados por Hamas y hoy lo volvemos a hacer. Reiteramos también nuestra solidaridad con las víctimas y sus familias. Los execrables actos que se perpetraron ese sábado en el sur de Israel no tienen excusa alguna y no deben ser olvidados. La humanidad entera debe repudiarlos de forma clara y frontal, pues justificar una atrocidad solo abre camino para que luego se justifiquen otras. Tampoco deben ser olvidados los rehenes que todavía siguen en poder de sus captores, quienes muy probablemente aún son víctimas de actos de violencia sexual, de acuerdo con el informe. El Ecuador, una vez más, demanda la inmediata e incondicional liberación de todos ellos y recuerda que este Consejo sí se ha pronunciado al respecto y lo ha hecho a través de 2 resoluciones de obligatorio cumplimiento. Cabe también recordar que todo lo dispuesto en estas 2 resoluciones, 2712 y 2720, debe ser implementado sin demora. El Ecuador considera que para el efecto es indispensable un cese al fuego inmediato. Las necesidades humanitarias de la población civil de Gaza son extremadamente urgentes y nada justifica ignorarlas o posponerlas. Señor presidente y colegas, el Estatuto de la Corte Penal Internacional señala que la violación y otras formas de violencia sexual constituyen crímenes de guerra y también son crímenes de lesa humanidad cuando se los comete como parte de un ataque generalizado o sistemático contra una población civil. En el informe recibido se señala que la misión realizada no tuvo un carácter investigativo y que es necesario que se lleven a cabo investigaciones exhaustivas que permitan determinar el alcance y la magnitud de la violencia sexual. Es esencial que esto se lleve a cabo. Para el efecto, exhortamos al gobierno de Israel a permitir el ingreso de la Oficina del Alto Comisionado para los Derechos Humanos y a la Comisión Internacional Independiente de Investigación sobre el territorio palestino ocupado, incluida Jerusalén Oriental e Israel. Es indispensable que se den procesos de rendición de cuentas de estos crímenes, en los que se garantice que los responsables sean investigados, procesados y condenados. La implementación de un cese al fuego y de cualquier acuerdo posterior debe tomar en cuenta las voces de mujeres y comunidades víctimas de violencia sexual, así como la necesidad de que se haga justicia para una verdadera reconciliación y la reconstrucción de una paz duradera. Asimismo, deben investigarse todas las denuncias sobre casos de violencia sexual en conflicto que hubieran tenido lugar en Cisjordania y Jerusalén Oriental por parte de colonos o fuerzas militares. Señor presidente, desde el pasado 7 de octubre, el dolor y la muerte han estado más presentes que nunca en Gaza y sus alrededores. Se ha olvidado el valor de la vida y la dignidad humana. El informe que acabamos de escuchar es una clara muestra de ello. Por ello, el Ecuador ha expresado su solidaridad con Israel y con Palestina, pues cada vida perdida es una tragedia. Es imperioso parar la violencia. Por ello, además, el Ecuador valora y apoya los intensos esfuerzos que se realizan para negociar un cese inmediato de las hostilidades en Gaza y la liberación de los rehenes. Es asimismo imperioso evitar que la violencia se extienda a otras zonas. Para ello, todas las partes deben demostrar especial prudencia y contención durante el sensible periodo de las festividades sagradas que ya ha iniciado. El status quo de los lugares santos de Jerusalén y el papel del Reino de Jordania como su custodio deben ser cuidadosamente respetados. Señor presidente, el pueblo israelí y el pueblo palestino tienen derecho a vivir en paz, con seguridad, con dignidad. Es necesario avanzar hacia una solución definitiva, pacífica y justa que lo permita, con la coexistencia de dos estados, Palestina e Israel, sobre la base de las fronteras de 1967 y de las resoluciones relevantes. Es preciso hacerlo ya. Muchas gracias.
I thank the representative of Ecuador for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. And let me start by welcoming Minister Katz, Israel's Minister of Foreign Affairs, for his presence here today. SRSG Patton, I want to thank you. I want to thank your team for producing this factual, methodical, and sobering report, a report that confirms what we have known for months. On October 7th, Hamas, a terrorist organization, carried out horrific acts of conflict-related sexual violence, including rape and gang rape. We knew this because victims, survivors, and first responders bravely came forward to share their stories and their evidence. We knew this because we saw the gruesome footage of Hamas's attack, footage that Hamas proudly filmed and shared online. And yet, so many people around the world, including some members of this council, have been silent in the face of these atrocities. Worse, some openly viewed these atrocities with suspicion and skepticism. And it's unforgivable, and it is a gross affront to all survivors of conflict-related sexual violence. Colleagues, I want to read a line from the UN's report. Quote, "The mission team found that several fully naked or partially naked bodies from the waist down were recovered, mostly women, with hands tied and shot multiple times, often in the head," unquote. There can be no doubt about what happened on October 7th. The evidence before us is damning and devastating. Now the only question is, how will we respond? Will this council finally condemn Hamas's sexual violence, or will we continue to stay silent? And I urge all council members to continually, unequivocally condemn Hamas's terrorist acts, as most of you have done today. As I've said many times before, this should not be difficult. This is the bare minimum. Colleagues, I also want to speak about the report's findings in the West Bank. The report notes, and I quote again, stakeholders indicated that the detention of Palestinian men and women has been compounded by alleged instances of cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment, including increased instances of various forms of sexual violence, unquote. Let me be clear. All parties to this conflict must uphold their obligations under international law with regard to the treatment of detained individuals. But as a democracy, we expect Israel to hold all of those who have committed these acts accountable for such acts. We also urge and expect members of this council to avoid drawing a false equivalency between these actions and hostage-taking by a foreign terrorist organization. But let me be clear, these two things are not the same. I also want to note the report's recommendation for Israel to sign a framework of cooperation with the Office of the SRSG SVC. This framework and independent investigations will help secure justice for victims and survivors of the October 7th attack, and for families whose loved ones are still being held by Hamas. Tragically, we know that Hamas's deranged acts of sexual violence are ongoing. The UN report found, and I quote again, clear and convincing information that some hostages have been subjected to various forms of conflict-related sexual violence, including rape and sexualized torture and sexualized, cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment, unquote. And, quote, reasonable grounds to believe that such violence may be ongoing, unquote. Each day hostages are detained by Hamas is another day they could be subjected to sexual violence and other horrors. Every single member state must call on Hamas to release every single hostage. But we also have to remember and remind Hamas that they continue to hold the remains of not just some of those who were taken on October 7th, but remains such as Hadar Golden, whose mother is here with us today, and his remains have to be returned to his grieving mother. And this council must call on Hamas to agree to the ceasefire deal on the table. Israel has already agreed to the terms of this deal. The fighting could and should stop today if Hamas would just release the first hostage and stop using people as pawns. If Hamas actually cared about the Palestinian people, it would agree to this deal, which would enable much more humanitarian relief to get into the hands of Palestinian civilians in Gaza who are starving, who don't have clean water or adequate shelter or essential medicines, many who live in abject fear that they or family members will not survive the night. As you all know, the United States has put forward a resolution that supports the negotiations happening on the ground and would help pave the way toward a sustainable cessation of hostilities and a lasting peace that will facilitate Israelis and Palestinians living side by side in peace and security. It also does what the Council has failed to do. It condemns Hamas. We will continue to work with all Council members to forge consensus around this resolution. Colleagues, next month, the SRSG will release her annual report, and we expect that it will show a substantial increase in conflict-related sexual violence around the world. In Sudan, in DRC, Nigeria, Ukraine, Haiti, the list goes on and on. Our charge has never been more clear. We must work together to bring perpetrators of conflict-related sexual violence to justice. We must work together to support survivors, all survivors, and we must work together to stamp out conflict-related sexual violence once and for all. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United States for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Algeria.
Thank you, Mr. President. Before delivering my statement, and on this auspicious first day of Ramadan, I extend heartfelt Ramadan Mubarak wishes to all celebrants, especially to our sister and brother in the occupied Palestinian territories, who endure the brutality of occupation. Mr. President, we listened carefully to the briefing from Madame Pattern, and we took note of it. I wish to emphasize the principles position of my country, Algeria. No one, man or woman, regardless of their nationality, religion, or origin, should endure the horror of sexual violence. Such acts are clearly condemned by our religion, Islam, and those responsible must face severe consequences within the bounds of law. It is imperative that fully fledged investigations into incidents of this nature are conducted with the utmost seriousness and diligence. We call for international independent investigations on all sexual violence in this region, as suggested by SRSG, Madam Patton. We had hoped for Mrs. Patton to be granted authorization to visit numerous detention centers where the human rights of Palestinians are being violated, with more than 3,884 detainees are held administratively, means without trial. Also, her presence in the Gaza Strip would have allowed her to witness firsthand the extent of sexual abuse inflicted upon Palestinians by the occupying forces, and convey them to the international community. Mr. President, for decades now, Palestinian women have borne the impact of a relentless assault, enduring discrimination and unspeakable violence on multiple fronts. The Palestinian population, and specifically women, have been subjected to a countless of brutalities, violating the very essence of their humanity and dignity. This plight, however, is not a recent phenomenon. It has persisted throughout the enduring occupation and exacerbated by a deliberate policy of collective punishment. And those responsible often remained shielded by a robe of impunity, Since 2001, despite the filing of 1,400 complaints by Palestinians regarding acts of torture, only 3 criminal investigations have been initiated. Surprisingly, none of these investigations have led to any indictment. None of these investigations have led to any indictment. In a terrifying incident in 2022, Israeli authorities labeled the NGO Defense for Children International Palestine as a terrorist entity. Why? Because they revealed the rape of a 15-year-old Palestinian child by Israeli military forces. This grim reality underscores that under occupations, Palestinians find no refuge from injustice. The systematic violation of the human right of Palestinian women is a grave injustice, violating their right to life, to health, to education, and to sustenance. And yet, accountability is a banned concept when the victims are Palestinians. Mr. President, although it is painful for me to mention them as mere numbers, they are not numbers. They are about human beings who have their dreams, who have their dignity stolen from them. Consider this staggering statistic. 30,000 Palestinians killed by the Israeli forces since the 7th of October. 9,000 of them were women. Among 70,000 wounded, 75% of them are women. Of the 7,000 missing persons, 70% are women and children. From the nearly 2 million forcibly displaced persons, 50% are females. Palestinian human rights organizations report intensified arrest operations by the Israeli occupation force, particularly affecting women. More than 8,000 Palestinians were arrested since October 7th. This is an alarming situation where visits to prisons are denied and arrests go unreported to the ICRC. This alarming situation has raised the concern of UN experts. UN experts will express serious concern about the arbitrary detention of hundreds of Palestinians, women and girls, many of them subjected to inhumane and degrading treatment. Instances have been reported where Palestinian women in Gaza were kept in a cage, in the rain and cold without food. UN experts express also deep distress over a report detailing physical and psychological abuses against Palestinian women and girls in detention, indicating that they have suffered many forms of sexual assault. Rape have been inflicted upon at least 2 female Palestinian detainees, with others threatened and intimidated with sexual violence. Mr. President, what the Palestinians, particularly women, endure is a litmus test for the credibility of international law and the global framework outlined in Security Council resolution. The consequences of our inaction may deal a disabling blow from which recovery is deterring. I conclude with the poignant word of Madame Paula Gaviria Betancourt, the UN Special Rapporteur of Human Rights of Internally Displaced Persons, who stated, and I quote, "The international community must relinquish the illusion that Israel will respect the principle of international humanitarian and human rights laws in its military operation. It is imperative to halt this atrocity immediately. This requires an urgent imposition by the Security Council of a ceasefire in Gaza. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Algeria for their statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as a representative of Japan. I thank SRSG Patton for her valuable briefing. We are profoundly concerned by the harrowing finding of the mission team that there are reasonable grounds to believe that the conflict-related sexual violence occurred in multiple locations during the terror attacks of 7th October last year. We are also greatly disturbed by the finding of the mission team that there is clear and convincing information that sexual violence has been committed against hostages. Such intolerable acts must be stopped immediately. More than 5 months have passed since Hamas and other abhorrent acts of terror against Israel took place. We unequivocally condemn these heinous acts and strongly call for the immediate and unconditional release of all remaining hostages held by Hamas and other groups, all the more so due to possible ongoing sexual violence against those hostages. The report has also found allegations of cruel, inhumane, and degrading treatment against Palestinians in detention, including the increased use of various forms of sexual violence, by which we are also deeply troubled. Sexual violence in conflict is a serious crime that violates not only the physical body, but also human dignity. Japan strongly calls for an end to such atrocious crimes. It must not be used as a tactic of war. Ensuring perpetrators are held accountable is vital. We must also uphold the highest integrity in reporting sexual violence to reduce further harm and stigma for survivors. At the same time, deeply concerned about the catastrophic situation in Gaza, Japan reiterates that all parties to the conflict must act in accordance with international law, including international humanitarian law. In this vein, a humanitarian ceasefire needs to be realized promptly in such a way as to ensure a conducive environment for the sufficient humanitarian assistance activities, as well as to lead the release of the remaining hostages, therefore resulting in the realization of a sustainable ceasefire. In conclusion, Japan reiterates its deep sympathy and solidarity with the victims of sexual violence, including those affected by the brutal violence since the October 7th attacks. Japan remains committed to combating all forms of sexual violence in conflict and alleviating the suffering of all victims of such violence. I shall now I resume my function as President of the Council. I now give the floor to the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine.
Mr. President, we are meeting as Muslims around the world are celebrating the holy month of Ramadan. In Gaza, death and suffering can be found everywhere. Food and hope can be found nowhere. The massacres of Palestinian civilians continue as we speak, and we and many of the people fasting had nothing to eat for suhoor and may have nothing to eat for iftar. We are meeting as the UN is hosting the Commission on the Status of Women, and Palestinian women and girls are being killed and maimed, are being made homeless and disabled, are being starved and humiliated, are being detained and traumatized. 9,000 Palestinian women have been killed by Israel in Gaza over the past 5 months alone. Every hour, 2 Palestinian mothers are killed. More than 13,000 Palestinian children have been killed, and tens of thousands have been orphaned. 1 million women and girls have been displaced, and all continue to live in inhumane conditions. We said months ago that the only way to end this occupation-made humanitarian crisis, the only way to spare civilian lives, the only way to allow Palestinian and Israeli families to reunite with their loved ones, the only way to avoid regional escalation is an immediate ceasefire. And I repeat, as many of you have said, an immediate ceasefire. But Netanyahu's political survival requires for the onslaught to continue. And so here we are, 5 months later, with a genocide underway before the eyes of the world and with no end in sight. Mr. President, Israel has violated the ICJ order for provisional measures, including by escalating its siege against the civilian population, depriving them of the essentials for life and creating conditions of famine. This doctrine of the use of humanitarian aid as a bargaining chip has been best formulated by the Israeli representative present in this chamber. Minister Katz stated at the beginning of the Israeli assault, and I quote, "No electrical switch will be turned on. No water pump will be opened, and no fuel truck will enter until the Israeli abductees are returned home." End of quotation. Effectively calling for the commission of atrocities. Israel's objective has not changed despite the denials of its foreign minister. Its objective remains the forcible displacement of our people by making Gaza unlivable. This includes cutting the lifeline that UNRWA represents for the Palestine refugees and displaced families in Gaza. UNRWA has documented the torture and abuse that UNRWA staff were subjected to by Israel, including severe physical beatings, waterboarding, and threats of harm to family members to force them to, and I quote, make false statements against the agency, including that the agency has affiliation with Hamas, end of quotation. The Israeli representative present in this chamber has provided cover to the killing and maiming of UNRWA staff by declaring, and I quote, there is no place for UNRWA in Gaza. The organization serves as an arm of Hamas, end of quotation. Such attacks against the UN, its Secretary General, and its agencies are unacceptable, dangerous, and should be decisively rejected. Mr. President, allow me to make some preliminary remarks on this meeting's agenda. 1, the Council has shown unprecedented reactivity by convening a briefing on a report released only a week ago. It should be noted that for years and decades now, reports and investigations regarding sexual assault against Palestinian women and men, girls and boys, have not led to the convening of a single council meeting on the matter, dealing with this issue as a human rights issue rather than a peace and security question. We hope that this meeting marks a change in this attitude and that more attention will be given by the Council to this matter in an unbiased manner. 2, we also note that the SRSG in her report has said that she did not seek to gather information and or to verify allegations in the context of the occupied Palestinian territory in order not to duplicate the ongoing work of other UN entities in this regard. And yet, none of these entities were invited today to present their findings on sexual violence against Palestinians. And I repeat, none of these entities were invited today to give briefings about their findings on sexual violations against Palestinians. And in this connection, we had a meeting about an hour before the convening of the Security Council with the SRSG, the Minister of Women's Affairs of the State of Palestine, and myself. And the minister, the Palestinian minister, extended an invitation to the SRSG to come and visit Gaza to see the violence, including sexual violence, committed against Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. And here I'm saying in this chamber that we extend an invitation to her to come and investigate or to report, not to investigate. She says she does not have an investigations power, but to come and to report to you about sexual violence against the Palestinian people in the Gaza Strip. 3, finally, we note that while the SRSG noted that she found convincing information of cases of sexual violence being perpetrated against Israelis, she also stressed that the visit was neither intended nor mandated to be investigative in nature, a mandate vested in other United Nations bodies which have promptly signaled their willingness and availability to investigate all such alleged violations. And she noted that, and I quote, the mission team was not able to interview any of the survivors, victims, end of quotation. The SRSG made therefore a recommendation that the government of Israel should grant, without further delay, access to the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem and Israel, to carry out fully fledged investigations into all alleged violations. I hereby declare our full readiness to cooperate with the Office of the High Commissioner and the Independent International Commission of Inquiry to come and investigate all allegations. To come and investigate all allegations. We will see who will facilitate and who will obstruct. I declare here, and I challenge, you know whom, to make a similar declaration of welcoming such bodies and committees to come and investigate, as many of you have suggested to be allowed to do so. And expect from this Council to demand Israel to do the same, since they keep saying they have nothing to hide. They have nothing to hide. If you have nothing to hide, why are you afraid of investigation? UN investigations. You have nothing to hide. And that they comply with international law, even though no single country on earth believes that to be the case against the backdrop of the reality we have all witnessed in the open in the Gaza Strip. One principle should guide us. Let the facts speak. Let the law decide. Let the facts speak. Let the law decide. But Israel fears the facts and despises the law. It has therefore refused to cooperate with any fact-finding mission or commission of inquiry over the years, as well as with the independent experts, denying them not only entry into Israel, but entry into the occupied Palestinian territory in its failed attempt to hide the truth. It even denied visas to the OHCHR as part of its assault against UN agencies. The Israeli Foreign Minister is here. Instead of bashing the UN for upholding its mandate, instead of coming here and attacking the Secretary General, who has appointed Ms. Patton, and instead of quoting the parts of the report that suit you and ignoring those that do not, say that you will finally allow the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth to be revealed. Let me also, in this connection, we once again, I repeat, we once again reiterate, nothing can justify violence targeting civilians. Nothing can justify violence targeting civilians, regardless of their religion, ethnic cleansing, nationality, sexual orientation. Nothing can justify that. Any civilian, including sexual violence, one of the most abhorrent forms of violence. Let me repeat this section. We once again reiterate, nothing can justify violence targeting civilians, any civilian, including sexual violence, one of the most abhorrent forms of violence. Mr. President, Israel has resorted to lies and distortions many times before to justify the killing of Palestinians and their disposition. We have always said that any serious allegations should be investigated seriously. But we have seen how Israel has helped spread false stories, knowing that irreparable harm would be done during the time it will take to refute them. This is the story of the beheaded babies, the story of the Hamas headquarters under Al-Shifa Hospital, and a story debunked in the report of the SRSG that has called it, quote unquote, unfounded, the, and I quote, highly publicized allegation of a pregnant woman whose womb had reportedly been ripped open before being killed with her fetus stabbed while still inside her, end of quotation. So selective quotation is not serving justice. The whole story, the truth, the whole truth should be told. Shamefully, this was never about the Israeli victims. This was about justifying the atrocities that Israel intended to commit against Palestinian victims. And for Israel, the truth is irrelevant in this pursuit. Mr. President, to look at the last decade alone, there was a landmark UNICEF report on Palestinian children in detention, published in 2013. It stated, and I quote, the interrogation mixes intimidation, threats, and physical violence with the clear purpose of forcing the children to confess. Children have been threatened with death, physical violence, solitary confinement, and sexual assault against themselves or a family member. Most children confess at the end of the interrogation, end of quotation. The report concludes, and I quote, that the ill treatment of children appears to be widespread, systematic, and institutionalized, end of quotation. A decade later, in 2024, UN experts expressed alarm over credible allegations of egregious human rights violations to which Palestinian women and girls continue to be subjected in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. And I quote, "We are particularly distressed by reports that Palestinian women and girls in detention have also been subjected to multiple forms of sexual assault, such as being stripped naked and searched by male Israeli army officers. At least 2 female Palestinian detainees were reportedly raped, while others were reportedly threatened with rape and sexual violence," end of quotations. This is the same report that my brother Ammar from Algeria referred to. And that's what the experts said. They also noted that photos of female detainees in degrading circumstances were also reportedly taken by the Israeli army and uploaded online. The High Commissioner for Human Rights found that Israeli security forces' arrests after 7 October were often accompanied by beating, ill treatment, and humiliation of Palestinian women and men, including acts of sexual assault, such as kicking genitals and threats of rape. Testimonies from victims and eyewitnesses were corroborated by videos posted by Israeli soldiers on social media showing ill treatment of Palestinians, including male detainees, photographed or recorded on video being stripped naked or half naked, blindfolded, handcuffed, physically abused, and humiliated by Israeli soldiers. These are not the actions of a group, but of a government represented at this table. We have denounced from day one selective outrage. We have denounced the double standards, the dehumanization of Palestinians, considering that our lives, our freedom, our dignity, our security are somehow less sacred or less important. We denounce all violations of international law. We will cooperate with any international investigation and continue to plead for accountability. But no one has ever been held accountable for the crimes committed against the Palestinian people, not even the crimes against our women and children. Israel is killing and maiming every day, detaining every day, destroying the homes of everyone, collectively punishing a nation. Before and after the 7th of October, for 75 years now since the Nakba. It is always the victim, even when it kills and destroys and steals. This is how they deal with it. It's us. We are responsible for our victimization by the Israeli occupying authority. And not a single Israeli leader, not a single member of the Israeli occupation forces has ever been held accountable for any crime committed against the Palestinian people. With officials with such a record, do you believe them when they come and talk to you? This impunity is what made this genocide possible. The fact the Israeli minister can come here to lecture the rest of the world while being part of a government committing atrocities as we speak is the demonstration of the blindness, the arrogance, and the criminality this impunity has fostered. Israel wants your weapons, and I must add the ammunition also, your money, your political support, and then attacks you and dismisses you, attacks this Security Council, these United Nations, all those calling for a ceasefire, all those calling for the law to be upheld. And yet, they come and lecture you. It is time for a change. And that change starts by ending Israeli impunity. Palestinians are being killed as we speak. Palestinian women and girls who have endured so much suffering over decades are confronting even worse levels of suffering today. There is no one protecting them from the killing, the fear, the famine, the disease, the humiliation, the torture. We count our victims by millions. I call on you again, stop this genocide, stop this war, ceasefire now. Ceasefire now, as it's been echoed by billions of people in all corners of the globe. You, the mighty Security Council, listen to the people. Listen to that call. Stop this genocide now. Call for a ceasefire now. And I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine for his statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Israel Katz, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Israel.
Excellencies, Ms. Patton, members of the Security Council of the United Nations, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to thank the United States, France, and the UK for heeding our call to summon this Council today, and to Japan for enabling this emergency meeting of the Council. Today, we are able to shine a light in the darkness of the families that have been harmed by those Hamas murderers who committed crimes against Israeli innocent people and against humanity. I'm standing here today in front of you as the Foreign Minister of the State of Israel, together with families whose members of them are kidnapped in Gaza and are in great danger. The families are here. I grieve sorrow in the name of the women and girls that were raped, murdered, and mutilated by Hamas terror murderers. I have come here to protest as loud as I can against the crimes against humanity that the Hamas murderers have committed with clear permission of their religious leaders in order to deter and scare the society of Israel. Those murderers were so proud to abuse and rape our poor victims that they took pictures and live video clips of their horrible acts. For too long, the UN has been silent on Hamas actions. During the last 5 months and 41 sessions in which the UN convened since October 7th, the UN never condemned nor disapproved these Hamas brutal crimes. The only one responsible for these crimes against humanity is Hamas. The Hamas murderers broke the borders and attacked peaceful Israeli innocent people in their homes and beds in the kibbutzim, villages, and cities. Young people, boys and girls, arrived from all over the world to the Nova Festival, a festival of peace and happiness. Hundreds of them were attacked from all sides and brutally abused and massacred. According to the report of the United Nations, this has not been an act of war. These acts were crimes against humanity of the highest level possible. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like you to close your eyes and imagine what you will feel if these were your children. No human being has to face such terrible acts like rape, murder, and abuse dead bodies. I'm expressing this message from the bottom of my heart and from the hearts of all the families of the victims. Hamas crimes are even worse than the terror actions carried out by Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and other terror organizations that were sanctioned here in the UN. Many countries have declared Hamas as a terror organization, including US, Australia, Canada, Japan, Paraguay, New Zealand, UK, the EU, and others. Please don't look away from the facts. Hamas must be declared as a terrorist organization and face the most heavy sanctions possible. The Muslim world is celebrating today the beginning of the Ramadan month, the holiest month for Muslims. Let me take this opportunity to bless our Muslim brothers with a Ramadan Kareem. Hamas is not speaking on behalf of the Muslim world, and we are asking you to condemn the sexual violence crimes these barbarians committed in the name of the Muslim religion. I'm demanding from the Security Council of the United Nations to put as much pressure as possible on the Hamas organization to release immediately and unconditionally all kidnapped hostages. Today, at this moment, as we speak, they are being abused, attacked, and in great danger. United Nations, please try your utmost to stop this living hell on earth. From the bottom of my heart, I'm expressing my gratitude to those countries that have supported and accepted and even initiated our point of view. Today, each and every one of you, members of the Security Council, have the opportunity to save 134 innocent lives. By doing so, you will show the world that the Security Council can be a shining light of justice and hope for all people. It is in your hands. Thank you.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Katz for his statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.